For 5 long years, I saved every extra penny I earned. I lived in a tiny apartment downtown, worked overtime shifts, and sacrificed vacations and luxuries that my friends took for granted. My goal was simple but challenging. I wanted a piece of land that was truly mine, a place where nature remained undisturbed, where I could escape the concrete jungle and breathe fresh air without neighbors pressing in from every side. When I finally found the property, I knew immediately it was worth every sacrifice I had made. The real estate listing described it as rural acreage with natural water feature, but those sterile words did not do justice to what awaited me. 10 acres of mixed woodland bordered by gentle hills, with a crystal-clear creek cutting through the heart of the property. The water burbled over smooth stones, creating natural pools where small fish darted in the sunlight. Old oak trees stretched their branches overhead, creating dappled shadows on the forest floor. Wildlife was abundant, deer tracks along the muddy banks, birdsong from dawn until dusk, and the occasional fox slipping silently between the trees. The house itself was modest but solid, a 2-bedroom cabin with a wide covered porch that faced the creek. The previous owner had built it with his own hands, using timber harvested from the property. It needed some work, updated plumbing, fresh paint, new kitchen appliances, but the bones were good. The moment I stepped onto that porch and heard nothing but wind in the trees and water flowing over rocks, I knew I was home. This was what independence felt like. This was what peace felt like. My property backed up against the eastern boundary of Pinecrest Estates, an upscale planned community with about 80 homes. From my back porch, I could just make out the rooftops of their houses through the trees, but the dense forest provided a natural barrier between us. Our properties were separated by a thin strip of conservation land that the county maintained as a fire break. In those early days, I barely gave my neighbors a second thought. They lived their manicured, regulated lives on one side of the forest, and I enjoyed my natural sanctuary on the other. During my first summer, I spent weekends clearing invasive plants from around the creek and repairing the small footbridge that allowed me to cross to the other side of my property. I planted a vegetable garden near the house and set up bird feeders that attracted cardinals, blue jays, and hummingbirds. Each evening, I would sit on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset filter through the trees, feeling grateful for this piece of paradise I could call my own. The first hint of trouble came on an otherwise perfect Saturday morning in late August. I was kneeling by the creek, clearing debris that had collected after a heavy rain, when I heard voices on the other side of my property line. Looking up, I spotted 3 people walking along the conservation strip, pointing toward my creek and taking photos with their phones. One man had a measuring tape extended from the property line to the water's edge. They were dressed in what I would come to recognize as the unofficial Pinecrest uniform: polo shirts, pressed khakis, sensible walking shoes. "Good morning," I called, more curious than concerned. "Can I help you with something?" They seemed startled to see me there. The woman, whose blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, recovered first. "Oh, hello. You must be the new owner. We were just admiring this lovely creek. Such a waste that it is only enjoyed by one household." Before I could respond to this odd comment, the tallest man stepped forward. "I am Walter Simmons, president of the Pinecrest Homeowners Association. We have been considering ways to enhance community access to natural spaces." "Community access," I repeated, not quite understanding. "This is private property." Walter smiled, but the warmth did not reach his eyes. Of course, just thinking aloud. Beautiful spot you have here. Shame about the limited access, though. A creek like this should be shared, do you not agree?" I did not agree, but I smiled politely and returned to my work. As they walked away, I heard the woman say something about easements and community benefit analysis. At the time, these words meant little to me. I should have paid more attention. I should have recognized the hungry looks they cast at my creek, my trees, my land. But I was still naive then, still believing that property lines and legal ownership would be respected by everyone. I did not yet understand that for some people, rules were merely inconveniences to be circumvented. I did not yet know that my peaceful sanctuary had already been targeted. The strange encounters continued throughout the fall. I would spot pairs of Pinecrest residents walking along my property line, sometimes with clipboards, sometimes with professional-looking camera equipment. Once, I caught a man hammering small wooden stakes into the ground near my creek. When confronted, he mumbled something about a survey for improvement planning and hurried away, leaving the stakes behind. I pulled them out and threw them in my fire pit. By early November, these incidents had become frequent enough that I began documenting them. I set up a trail camera near the property line and started keeping a journal of dates, times, and descriptions of the people I observed. Most seemed to be avoiding direct contact with me, scurrying away when I approached. Their behavior made me increasingly uneasy, but I had no legal grounds to stop them from walking along the conservation easement, as long as they did not cross onto my land. Then came the certified letter. I remember standing in my kitchen, slicing open the official-looking envelope with mounting dread. The letter was printed on Pinecrest HOA letterhead and filled with dense legal language that made my stomach tighten. It claimed that historical property records indicated a grandfathered access easement across my property that provided the Pinecrest community with rights of passage to and along the creek. The letter graciously offered to work with me on determining the least disruptive implementation of this alleged easement. My hands were shaking with anger by the time I finished reading. I had thoroughly researched the property before purchasing it. I had reviewed every document, every survey, every potential encumbrance. There was absolutely no easement across my land, grandfathered or otherwise. This was a fabrication, a blatant attempt to claim rights to my property that did not exist. I spent that night at my computer, pulling up digital copies of my property deed, survey maps, and county records. I created a folder of documentation proving my clear title and the absence of any easements. The next morning, I called the county records office to confirm what I already knew. The clerk was sympathetic and clear. "There are no recorded easements on your property, Mr. Johnson. Not now, not ever." Armed with this confirmation, I requested a meeting with the Pinecrest HOA board. My request was granted with surprising speed, and 3 days later, I found myself walking into the Pinecrest Community Center. The meeting room was cold and sterile, with uncomfortable folding chairs arranged in rows facing a raised platform where the board members sat. About 20 residents were scattered throughout the audience section, most looking bored or checking their phones. Walter Simmons called the meeting to order exactly on time, working through several minor HOA violations before reaching my item on the agenda. "Next, we have Mr. Johnson here to discuss the creek access easement implementation." I approached the microphone set up in the center aisle. "Good evening. I am here because I received a letter claiming there is an easement across my property. I want to be absolutely clear. There is no such easement. I have brought copies of my deed, property survey, and confirmation from the county records office." I held up my folder of documentation. "I respectfully request that you correct your records and cease making these false claims." The board members exchanged glances. Cynthia Blackwell, the HOA secretary, leaned forward. "Mr. Johnson, our research indicates that this easement predates current record-keeping systems. It was established when this entire area was part of the Henderson Farm back in 1932. That is simply not true, I replied, feeling heat rise in my face. The Henderson Farm Property Division was fully documented, and no such easement was ever recorded. I have the complete chain of title going back to 1920. Walter smiled that same empty smile I had seen by the creek. Mr. Johnson, we appreciate your input, but our legal team has advised us of our rights in this matter. The easement exists, whether currently documented or not. We will be proceeding with our access improvement plans. For nearly 20 minutes, I presented evidence, cited property law, and explained basic principles of land ownership. The board members nodded politely, but their eyes had a glazed look that told me they had already made their decision. My documentation was dismissed as incomplete or irrelevant to historical arrangements. When I finally ran out of arguments, Walter thanked me for my time and moved on to the next agenda item as if the matter was settled. I left the meeting furious and bewildered. How could they simply ignore documented facts? How could they claim rights that clearly did not exist? I would soon learn the answer. The next morning, I heard the sound of chainsaws coming from the edge of my property. I ran outside to find 3 men in work clothes cutting down trees along my creek bank. A rough path was being cleared, extending from the conservation strip right onto my land. "Stop, this is private property," I shouted, running toward them. "You are trespassing." The workers paused, looking uncertain. One pulled out a cell phone and stepped away to make a call. Within minutes, a black SUV pulled up on the conservation strip, and Walter Simmons emerged, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit whom I had not seen before. "Mr. Johnson," Walter said smoothly, "this is Greg Thornton, the Pinecrest HOA attorney. We are simply exercising our easement rights. Please do not interfere with the workers." I stood at the edge of my property, fists clenched at my sides, watching as strangers violated my sanctuary. The chainsaws resumed their destructive work, the smell of fresh-cut wood filling the air. Birds scattered from nearby trees, alarmed by the noise and activity. I took out my phone and began recording, documenting each trespasser, each felled tree, each moment of this invasion. This was no longer about easement claims. This was open theft of property rights. And I was just one person standing against an organized group with resources and determination. But I would not back down. This was my land, my creek, my home, and I would fight for it with everything I had. The Pinecrest Quarterly newsletter arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, having been delivered to all addresses within a half-mile radius of the community. I almost threw it away unopened, assuming it contained the usual announcements about garden competitions and community picnics. On impulse, I flipped through its glossy pages while standing by my recycling bin. My blood ran cold when I reached page 3. Under the heading, "Exciting Community Enhancement Project Approved," was a full-color architectural rendering of an elaborate wooden bridge spanning a creek that was unmistakably mine. The design showed a substantial structure with decorative railings, built-in benches, and even lighting fixtures. The accompanying article described it as a scenic viewing platform that would connect our community with the natural beauty that surrounds us and enhance property values throughout Pinecrest Estates. The newsletter slipped from my fingers as shock gave way to anger. This was not a simple footpath they were planning. This was a major construction project on my property, announced to the entire community as if it were already a done deal. I drove immediately to the county clerk's office and requested copies of any building permits or applications filed by the Pinecrest HOA. The clerk found nothing. No permits had been applied for, much less granted. When I returned home, there was a large manila envelope leaning against my front door. Inside were detailed architectural drawings of the proposed bridge, along with a cover letter explaining that construction would begin in 30 days. The drawings revealed that this was no modest structure. The bridge would span 60 feet across the widest part of the creek, with concrete footings sunk deep into both banks. Solar-powered lights would illuminate it at night. Benches would allow people to sit and linger. It was designed to accommodate groups of up to 30 people at once. I spread the blueprints across my kitchen table and studied them with growing horror. The bridge would be visible from my porch. Its lighting would disrupt the darkness I cherished at night. The traffic of people coming and going would destroy the peace and privacy that had drawn me to this property in the first place. And all of this was planned without my permission, on land that I legally owned. The next morning, I called a local attorney specializing in property disputes. James Harrington agreed to see me that afternoon. His office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, with dark wood paneling and shelves lined with legal texts. I brought all my documentation, including the newsletter, architectural plans, and records proving my ownership. James listened carefully, taking notes as I explained the situation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "They have absolutely no legal right to build anything on your property. No easement exists, and even if it did, an easement for access does not grant construction rights." He tapped his pen against his legal pad. "We will send them a formal cease and desist letter immediately. If they proceed after that, we can file for an emergency injunction." I felt a surge of relief. The law was clearly on my side. Surely once the HOA received an official legal warning, they would back down. The cease and desist letter was delivered by courier the following day. It outlined in precise legal language that the Pinecrest HOA had no right to build on my property, that any construction would constitute trespassing and property damage, and that legal action would follow if they did not immediately abandon their plans. For 5 days there was silence. No response from the HOA, no activity along the property line. I began to hope that the letter had worked, that faced with legal reality, they had decided to find another project to pursue. That hope died on the 6th day, when I returned from grocery shopping to find 3 large trucks parked along the conservation strip. Workers were unloading lumber, concrete forms, and heavy equipment. A portable generator hummed loudly, powering tools that were being set up on folding tables. I parked my car and approached a man who appeared to be supervising. "Excuse me, but what is happening here?" He consulted a clipboard. "Bridge construction for Pinecrest Estates. We start foundation work tomorrow morning." "On whose authority? This is private property and no permission has been granted." The foreman looked uncomfortable. "Look, I just go where they send me. All I know is we have a contract with the Pinecrest HOA to build a community bridge. If there is a problem with permissions, you need to take that up with them." I called James immediately, standing beside my car as the workers continued unloading materials. He promised to file for an emergency injunction first thing in the morning, but warned that it might take several days for a judge to hear the case. In the meantime, he advised documenting everything, but avoiding direct confrontation with the workers. That night, I stood at my living room window, watching headlights sweep across the trees as more vehicles arrived. Portable floodlights were set up, creating harsh pools of illumination in the darkness. The sound of men's voices and equipment being moved echoed across my formerly peaceful property. I felt violated, helpless, and increasingly angry. Through the trees, I could see residents from Pinecrest walking over to inspect the preparations, pointing toward my creek, laughing and talking excitedly about their new amenity. I slept poorly, waking repeatedly to the unfamiliar sounds outside. At dawn, I made coffee and stepped onto my porch. The sight that greeted me was worse than I had feared. A small army of workers was already moving onto my property, carrying tools and materials. Surveying equipment was being set up along the creek bank. Spray paint marked the locations where footings would be dug. My sanctuary was being invaded, my property rights ignored, my legal ownership dismissed as irrelevant in the face of the HOA's determination to have their bridge. I took out my phone and began recording, my hands trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. This was not just about a bridge anymore. This was about power and entitlement, about people who believed rules did not apply to them. And I was standing alone against a force that seemed determined to take what was mine, regardless of law, ethics, or basic respect for property rights. The battle lines were drawn, and the invaders were advancing. My peaceful dream property had become a battleground. The mechanical beeping of construction vehicles reversing pierced the morning air at exactly 7:00 a.m. From my kitchen window, I watched in horror as a small bulldozer rolled off a flatbed truck and headed straight for my creek bank. Men in hard hats and reflective vests swarmed across my property as if they owned it, carrying tools, unrolling plans, and marking the ground with flags and spray paint. The invasion had begun in earnest. I threw on clothes and rushed outside, still pulling on my jacket as I ran toward the creek. The foreman from yesterday was directing workers to unload bags of concrete mix from a pickup truck. Several men were already digging into the soft earth of the creek bank, preparing holes for the bridge foundations. "Stop this right now," I shouted, approaching the foreman. "This is private property. You have no legal right to be here or to build anything." The foreman sighed as if dealing with a misbehaving child. "Look, buddy, I told you yesterday, we have a contract. Your beef is with the HOA, not with us. We are just doing our job." "Your job is trespassing and property damage," I replied, pulling out my phone. "I am calling the police." Two officers arrived 20 minutes later, during which time I stood helplessly watching the destruction continue. The younger officer seemed sympathetic as I explained the situation and showed them my property deed and the cease and desist letter. The older officer, however, looked bored. "Sorry, sir, but this appears to be a civil dispute," he said after a brief conversation with the construction foreman. "The HOA claims they have rights to build here. You claim they do not. We cannot determine property rights or easement validity. You will need to resolve this through the courts." "But they are trespassing," I protested. "They are damaging my property right now as we speak." The older officer shook his head. "If they genuinely believe they have legal permission to be here, it is not criminal trespassing. This is a civil matter." As the police car pulled away, Walter Simmons arrived in his black SUV, accompanied by 3 other HOA board members. They walked onto my property with the confidence of owners, nodding approvingly at the construction progress. "Mr. Johnson," Walter called, his tone falsely pleasant, "I see you are monitoring our community improvement project." "This is illegal," I said, holding my phone up to record the conversation. "You have received a cease and desist letter. My attorney is filing for an emergency injunction today." Cynthia Blackwell stepped forward, her smile tight and unfriendly. "We are proceeding on advice of our legal counsel. If you continue attempting to obstruct community improvements, we will be forced to take legal action against you." Legal action? I could not believe what I was hearing. "I am the property owner. You are the trespassers." Greg Thornton, the HOA attorney, adjusted his expensive glasses. "Mr. Johnson, the Pinecrest HOA has voted unanimously to assert our easement rights to provide community access to natural features. We have allocated substantial funds for both construction and any necessary legal defense. I suggest you reconsider your opposition." The implied threat was clear. They had money, organization, and a willingness to engage in lengthy legal battles. They were counting on me giving up, on being overwhelmed by their resources and determination. I stood my ground, continuing to record as they walked around my property discussing construction details as if I were invisible. Throughout that day, I documented everything: the arrival of each truck, the placement of each foundation form, the trees damaged by equipment, the creek water turning muddy as soil was disturbed. I took photographs of license plates, company names on trucks, and the faces of workers and HOA members. I recorded video of heavy equipment crossing my property line, of concrete being mixed and poured, of wildlife fleeing the noise and activity. By afternoon, the damage was already substantial. 4 large holes had been dug on the near side of the creek, now filled with steel rebar cages ready for concrete. The far bank was marked for similar treatment the next day. The natural contour of the creek bank had been altered to accommodate the bridge design. Trees that had stood for decades had been cut down to clear the path. Residents from Pinecrest began arriving to watch the progress, standing in small groups at the edge of the property line. Some took selfies with the construction site in the background. Others pointed toward my house, whispering and occasionally laughing. I heard fragments of conversation as I moved around taking photographs. Finally getting access to the creek. Property values will definitely increase. He cannot possibly stop progress. One elderly woman approached me as I stood documenting a particularly large tree being cut down. "You know, young man, you are being terribly selfish. That creek could bring joy to so many families if you would just share." "Share?" I replied, incredulous. "They are building a massive structure on my property without permission. That is not sharing, that is taking." She sniffed disapprovingly and walked away. By sunset, the West Bank foundation footings had been poured. Concrete trucks had come and gone, leaving deep tire tracks across my once pristine land. Construction debris littered the area: discarded coffee cups, plastic packaging, cigarette butts. The clear water of the creek now ran cloudy with disturbed sediment. I watched a family of ducks that had nested nearby for years swim frantically away downstream, confused and displaced by the alien activity. As darkness fell, most workers packed up and left, but the portable floodlights remained, casting harsh illumination across the construction site. The quiet darkness that I had cherished was gone, replaced by the steady hum of generators. I returned to my house, physically and emotionally exhausted. James had called to confirm that our request for an emergency injunction had been filed, but no hearing date had been set yet. I sat on my porch in the semi-darkness, looking out at the floodlights illuminating the damaged creek bank. The realization hit me hard. Even if I eventually won in court and stopped the bridge from being completed, irreparable harm had already been done. Trees that had stood for generations were now stumps. The natural contour of the land had been altered. Wildlife had been driven away. My sense of peace and security in my own home had been shattered. As I finally went inside to try to sleep, a new determination took root. This was no longer just about stopping a bridge. It was about holding accountable those who believed they could take whatever they wanted, who saw rules as obstacles to be circumvented rather than principles to be respected. The Pinecrest HOA had declared war on my property rights. They had no idea how determined I could be when fighting for what was rightfully mine. The county courthouse was an imposing limestone building with tall columns flanking the entrance. James N. I arrived 45 minutes early for our emergency injunction hearing, carrying folders bulging with documentation. We sat on a hard wooden bench outside courtroom C, reviewing our arguments one last time. James had prepared a compelling case based on clear property rights, trespassing laws, and the absence of any recorded easement. "Remember," James advised quietly, "Judge Peterson tends to favor established community entities, but he is also a stickler for proper documentation. Let me do the talking unless he directly questions you." The Pinecrest contingent arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled hearing. Walter, Cynthia, two other board members, and their attorney Greg Thornton, accompanied by a younger lawyer carrying multiple legal binders. They nodded coldly in our direction before taking seats on the opposite side of the hallway. When we were called into the courtroom, Judge Peterson was already reviewing documents at the bench. He was an older man with white hair and reading glasses perched low on his nose. He listened impassively as James presented our case, detailing my clear ownership, the absence of any easement, and the ongoing damage to my property. I provided sworn testimony about the construction activities and entered my photographs and videos as evidence. When it was the HOA's turn, Greg Thornton presented a very different narrative. He spoke of historical community access that predated modern record-keeping, of reasonable accommodation for public benefit, and of established patterns of usage that supposedly constituted an implied easement. He presented affidavits from longtime residents claiming they had always used paths along the creek, though none of these supposed paths had existed on my property during my ownership. Judge Peterson interrupted several times to ask for clarification or additional documentation. His expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. After both sides had presented their arguments, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "This appears to be a complex property dispute that cannot be fully resolved in an emergency hearing," he stated. "While Mr. Johnson has presented compelling evidence of ownership, the Pinecrest HOA raises interesting questions about historical access rights. Pending a full evidentiary hearing, which I am scheduling for 60 days from today, I am denying the emergency injunction." "However," he added as James began to protest, "I am ordering that any construction activities must remain within 20 feet of the property line until the full hearing can be conducted. No permanent structures may be completed before that time." It was a devastating compromise. While restricting the construction zone, the judge had essentially granted permission for work to continue. The HOA attorney and board members exchanged satisfied glances as we left the courtroom. Outside in the hallway, Walter had the audacity to approach me. "We are still open to discussing a reasonable accommodation, Mr. Johnson," he said smoothly. "Perhaps you would care to join us for lunch to explore options." "No, thank you," I replied stiffly, turning away. James tried to find the silver lining as we walked to the parking lot. "The limitation to within 20 feet of the property line will slow them down, and we have 60 days to build a stronger case for the full hearing." But we both knew that by the time the full hearing occurred, much of the damage would already be done. The bridge foundations were already in place. The construction would continue, just at a slightly reduced scale temporarily. The judge's ruling felt like permission for the violation to proceed. That evening, I sat at my computer, anger and frustration fueling a new determination. If the legal system would not provide immediate protection, I needed to find another approach. I began researching the Pinecrest HOA board members, looking for information that might explain their aggressive actions. Why this obsession with my creek? Why the willingness to engage in possibly illegal activity and expensive legal battles for a simple amenity? The answers began emerging around midnight. Walter Simmons and Cynthia Blackwell had both recently purchased additional properties near the back entrance of Pinecrest Estates, properties that would significantly increase in value if they had creek access, as a selling point. Two other board members owned small construction companies that had received contracts for HOA projects in the past. Financial self-interest, not community benefit, appeared to be driving the bridge project. Digging deeper, I discovered a pattern. This was not the Pinecrest HOA's first aggressive action against neighboring property owners. 3 years earlier, they had pressured an elderly couple into granting access for a walking trail across their land by threatening constant legal action the couple could not afford to fight. 2 years before that, they had claimed a MAPI. NG error had placed part of a community park on HOA property, resulting in the park being reduced in size and the reclaimed land sold to a developer with connections to board members. I created a detailed spreadsheet tracking property purchases, business connections, and the timing of HOA decisions. I gathered public records showing how board members had personally profited from previous community improvement projects. I found social media posts where board members had discussed leveraging HOA funds for personal investment opportunities. By morning, my living room walls resembled a detective's investigation board. Printouts, maps, and photographs connected by colored string showed the web of relationships and financial interests behind the bridge project. This was not about community access to nature. This was about a small group of people using their positions of authority to increase their personal wealth at the expense of others. Armed with this new understanding, I began contacting other victims of the Pinecrest HOA's tactics. The elderly couple initially refused to speak with me, clearly still frightened of retaliation. But the former park administrator agreed to meet, bringing documents that corroborated my suspicions about the mapping error that had benefited board members. Meanwhile, construction continued at the creek. The judge's order limiting activity to within 20 feet of the property line had little practical effect, as the bridge design had already placed most foundations within that zone. Concrete pilings now rose from both banks, with wooden support structures beginning to take shape. Each day brought more noise, more disruption, more destruction of the natural environment I had sought to protect. I filed formal complaints with the County Ethics Board regarding the conflicts of interest I had uncovered. I submitted evidence to the State Attorney General's office suggesting possible fraud in the HOA's representations to its own members. I wrote letters to local newspapers detailing the pattern of self-dealing I had discovered. But bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, and none of these actions seemed likely to stop the bridge construction before it was completed. As the days passed, I watched helplessly as my beloved creek was transformed. The natural banks were replaced by engineered slopes. The surrounding trees were thinned to provide views from the planned bridge. The water quality deteriorated as construction runoff entered the stream despite the token silt fences the workers had installed. My once peaceful sanctuary had become a construction zone, and the legal system that should have protected my property rights had failed me. But as I updated my investigation board with new connections and evidence, a different kind of hope began to form. The Pinecrest HOA might win the battle for the bridge, but perhaps they could still lose the war. Their pattern of self-dealing and abuse of power could be their undoing, if only I could find a way to expose it effectively before it was too late. 3 weeks into the construction, I had fallen into an unhappy routine of daily documentation. Each morning, I would walk the property line, photographing progress and noting any new violations or environmental damage. The bridge was taking shape rapidly. The concrete foundations were complete, and workers had begun assembling the wooden superstructure. Despite my ongoing legal efforts, momentum seemed to be entirely on the HOA's side. On a Wednesday morning, I was standing at my usual observation point when something caught my eye. The eastern support column, which anchored the bridge on my side of the creek, appeared to be listing slightly. It was a subtle tilt, barely noticeable unless you were looking carefully. But having watched this construction daily, any change drew my attention. I took several close-up photographs and then moved to a different angle. Yes, there was definitely something off about the alignment. The concrete base seemed to be sinking slightly on one side, causing the entire column to lean perhaps 2 or 3 degrees from vertical. I took more photographs, including some with reference objects to document the tilt. That afternoon, I reviewed all my construction photos chronologically. The issue had begun about 4 days earlier, coinciding with heavy rains that had temporarily halted work. The soil around the eastern foundation had been visibly saturated, and subsequent photos showed progressive tilting of the support column. I am not an engineer, but I had worked summer jobs in construction during college and understood basic principles. Foundations built on inadequately compacted or unstable soil could shift over time, especially when subjected to water saturation and weight. If the HOA's engineers had failed to properly assess the soil conditions on my creek bank, they might have designed an inadequate foundation for the actual site conditions. The next morning, I contacted Mark Reynolds, a structural engineer who had consulted on a small bridge project for my previous employer. I explained the situation and asked if he would be willing to review my photographs and visit the site. Mark agreed, though he warned that without access to the original engineering plans, his assessment would be limited. 2 days later, Mark met me at my property. He brought professional equipment to measure the tilt of the supports and assess other aspects of the construction. We spent nearly 3 hours examining the bridge structure, with Mark taking measurements, photographs, and soil samples from around the foundations. "Well, your instincts were correct," Mark said finally, packing away his equipment. "There are serious problems here. The eastern foundation is definitely shifting, and based on the soil composition, that movement is likely to continue. The western supports show similar issues to a lesser degree, but there is more." He pulled out his tablet and showed me close-up images he had taken of the wooden structural members. "See these connectors. They are underspecified for the load they will need to bear, and the cross-bracing is inadequate for a span of this length, especially one designed to hold multiple people." "Is it dangerous?" I asked. Mark hesitated. "I would not want to be standing on it during a strong wind, or if more than a dozen people were using it simultaneously. The design does not appear to include adequate safety factors, and the soil conditions are completely unsuitable for the foundation design they have implemented." Mark prepared a detailed report documenting all the deficiencies he had identified. The eastern foundation was built on soil with high clay content that became unstable when saturated. The support beams were undersized for the planned load capacity. The connection points between major structural elements used fewer and smaller bolts than standard engineering practices would dictate. Lateral bracing was insufficient to prevent swaying under load or wind conditions. "Based on my professional assessment," Mark concluded in his report, "this structure represents a significant safety hazard and does not appear to comply with county building codes for pedestrian bridges." Armed with this expert opinion, I immediately filed a formal complaint with the county building inspector's office. I attached Mark's report, my photographs, and a timeline of the construction process. The complaint specifically noted that no building permits had been posted at the construction site, raising the question of whether proper approvals had been obtained at all. 2 days later, a county building inspector named Roy Winters arrived to examine the bridge. I showed him Mark's findings and walked him through the visible issues. Roy took his own measurements and photographs, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "This should never have gotten this far," he admitted, making notes on his clipboard. "I will issue a stop work order pending review of permits and engineering specifications. They will need to provide documentation that this structure meets code requirements before proceeding." Relief washed over me as Roy posted the official stop work order at the construction site. Finally, someone with authority was acknowledging the problems. When the construction crew arrived the next morning, they were forced to pack up their equipment and leave. I savored a moment of victory, however small, as I watched them drive away. That afternoon my phone rang. It was Walter Simmons. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I understand you have been making unfounded accusations about our community project. This is completely unacceptable." "The accusations are not unfounded," I replied calmly. "A professional engineer has identified serious safety issues, and the county building inspector agrees. If you had bothered to get proper permits and follow building codes, none of this would be happening." "We have all necessary approvals," Walter insisted. "There has simply been a clerical error in processing the paperwork. We will resolve this minor setback quickly." I doubted very much that all approvals had been obtained, but I said nothing. Let them try to produce documentation that did not exist. Let them explain to county officials why construction had begun without posted permits. Let them defend engineering specifications that clearly violated safety standards. My satisfaction was short-lived. 3 days later, the stop work order was lifted. I called Roy Winters in disbelief. "I am sorry, Mr. Johnson," he said, sounding genuinely regretful. "They submitted revised engineering plans that address the issues we identified. Technically, they now meet minimum code requirements." "But what about building without permits?" I demanded. "They produced an approval letter," Roy replied. "It was irregular, but my supervisor has accepted it. My hands are tied." I later learned through a sympathetic clerk at the county office that the HOA had connections in the building department, a deputy director whose brother-in-law sat on the Pinecrest board. The approval letter had been backdated, and the revised engineering plans bore little resemblance to the actual construction taking place. But on paper, everything now appeared legitimate. Construction resumed the very next day, proceeding at an even faster pace than before. Additional workers were brought in. The hours extended earlier in the morning and later into the evening. Lights blazed throughout the night as crews worked in shifts. The HOA was clearly determined to complete the bridge before any further obstacles could be raised. I watched with mounting concern as the structure took shape. Despite the supposedly revised plans, I could see that the fundamental issues remained unaddressed. The eastern foundation continued to show signs of settling. The undersized support beams were being installed as originally designed. If anything, the accelerated pace meant that less care was being taken with critical structural elements. I filed additional complaints with the building department, the county commissioners, and even the state engineering board. Each time, my concerns were acknowledged, documented, and then effectively ignored. The HOA's influence appeared to reach further than I had imagined. One evening, as I stood watching workers install decorative railings on the nearly completed bridge, I noticed something disturbing. The warning notices that had been attached to my earlier complaints, papers that should have been maintained in the official job file kept on site, were being removed from the construction trailer and thrown away. When I approached to investigate, a security guard who had recently been posted at the site blocked my access. "Private construction area," he said firmly. "No trespassing." "This is my property," I reminded him. He shrugged. "I have my orders. No one approaches the bridge site without HOA authorization." I backed away, fuming at the absurdity of being denied access to my own land. But the incident confirmed what I had suspected. The HOA was systematically removing or hiding evidence of the safety concerns that had been raised. They were creating a paper trail that showed full compliance while proceeding with the flawed original design. The next day, glossy invitations began appearing in mailboxes throughout the community. The Pinecrest Homeowners Association cordially invited residents to the grand opening ceremony of the new Pinecrest Creek Bridge, to be held that Sunday afternoon. The invitation promised champagne, catering, and speeches by board members. It asked attendees to gather on the bridge itself for a group photograph to commemorate this historic community achievement. I stared at the invitation that had been mistakenly delivered to my address, a cold realization settling in my stomach. They were going to put dozens of people on that bridge at once. The exact scenario that Mark had warned could be catastrophic, and they were going to do it before any final inspections could be conducted, creating a fait accompli that would be difficult for officials to challenge after the fact. I called Mark immediately and described the situation. "You need to warn them explicitly," he advised. "Send a formal letter stating the dangers and your objections. Copy every official you can think of, building department, county commissioners, sheriff, everyone. Create a paper trail showing you tried to prevent whatever happens." I followed his advice, sending registered letters to the HOA board and every relevant government agency. I attached Mark's report, my photographs of the continuing issues, and the invitation showing the planned gathering on the bridge. I explicitly warned that the structure was potentially unsafe for large groups. Most of my letters went unanswered. The single response came from Greg Thornton, the HOA attorney, and consisted of a thinly veiled threat of legal action if I continued to defame a properly permitted community project or interfered with the planned celebration. As the week progressed, the bridge was completed with remarkable speed. Decorative elements were added, carved wooden finials on the railing posts, solar-powered lights along the walkway, even hanging flower baskets at each end. From a distance, it looked charming and solid. Only someone who had closely observed the construction process would know the dangerous flaws hidden beneath the attractive exterior. By Saturday, workers were placing the final touches, staining the wood with waterproof sealer, installing commemorative plaques at each end, setting up temporary supports for ribbon-cutting ceremony decorations. Everything was proceeding according to the HOA's accelerated schedule, despite my warnings and the documented safety issues. That night I stood at my window looking out at the illuminated bridge spanning my creek. It was an impressive structure visually, I had to admit. In different circumstances, built properly and with legitimate permission, it might even have been an asset. But constructed as it was, on stolen land with inadequate engineering, driven by hidden financial motives, it represented everything I had come to despise about the Pinecrest HOA. Their entitlement, their disregard for rules, their willingness to put their own interests above safety and property rights. As I turned away from the window, my gaze fell on the invitation to the grand opening ceremony. A plan began forming in my mind. I could not physically stop the ceremony from taking place. I could not force the HOA to address the structural issues before putting people on the bridge. But I could document whatever happened. I could create an undeniable record of their recklessness and the consequences that might follow. I went to my closet and pulled out my best camera equipment, the high-definition video camera with excellent zoom capabilities, the tripod for stability, spare batteries to ensure continuous recording. I would position myself at a safe distance, with a clear view of the entire bridge. I would capture everything that happened at the grand opening ceremony, creating evidence that could not be denied or covered up later. If the bridge held despite its flaws, so be it. I would continue my legal battle on other fronts. But if the structural weaknesses manifested under the weight of dozens of celebrating HOA members and residents, well, that would be entirely their own doing. I had warned them, repeatedly and explicitly. The choice to proceed was theirs alone, as would be the consequences of that decision. Sunday dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for an outdoor celebration. From early morning, workers were busy setting up for the grand opening ceremony. Tables with white tablecloths appeared at each end of the bridge. Catering, vans delivered trays of food and coolers of champagne. A small podium with a microphone was positioned at the center of the bridge, where the HOA board would make their triumphant speeches. I had positioned myself strategically on a small rise about 50 yards downstream. From this vantage point, I had an excellent view of the entire bridge while remaining on my own property at a safe distance. My camera was mounted on a tripod, battery fully charged, with a clear line of sight to the proceedings. I began recording well before the scheduled start time, documenting the final preparations and the gradual arrival of guests. By 2 o'clock, a substantial crowd had gathered. Residents of Pinecrest Estates arrived in their Sunday best, many carrying champagne flutes from home as requested in the invitation. The atmosphere was festive, with children running around the creek banks and adults mingling in excited groups. No one seemed concerned about gathering on a structure that had been rushed to completion without proper oversight. The HOA board members arrived together, dressed formally for the occasion. Walter wore a light gray suit, while Cynthia had chosen a floral dress and wide-brimmed hat suitable for an outdoor garden party. They moved through the crowd accepting congratulations, as if they had accomplished something worthy of admiration, rather than an illegal land grab with dangerous execution. At precisely 2:30, Walter approached the microphone at the center of the bridge. He tapped it twice, the amplified sound drawing everyone's attention. The crowd began moving onto the bridge itself, filling the walkway from end to end as instructed for the ceremonial photograph and speeches. I estimated at least 60 people crowded onto the structure, far exceeding the safe capacity that Mark had suggested. "Distinguished residents of Pinecrest Estates," Walter began, his voice carrying clearly over the speaker system. "Today marks a triumph of community vision and perseverance. This beautiful bridge represents our commitment to enhancing the natural beauty of our neighborhood and providing access to amenities for all residents." The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Walter gestured expansively, soaking in the adulation. "Many of you know that this project faced certain obstacles," he continued with a knowing smile. "There were those who selfishly tried to keep this beautiful creek private, who did not understand the concept of community benefit." My jaw tightened as he deliberately mischaracterized my defense of my legal property rights as selfishness. But I remained focused on documenting the event, making sure my camera captured everything. "But the Pinecrest HOA board persevered," Walter declared proudly. "We overcame every challenge, and today we stand, literally stand, on the results of our determination." More applause rippled through the crowd. Cynthia stepped forward to speak next, taking the microphone from Walter. As S.H.E. launched into her prepared remarks about property values and community aesthetics, I noticed something through my camera viewfinder. The eastern end of the bridge, the section with the foundation I had seen tilting weeks earlier, appeared to be dipping very slightly under the weight of the crowd. "This project has been my personal passion," Cynthia was saying, unaware of the subtle movement beneath her feet. As your HOA secretary and a proud Pinecrest resident, I have always believed that our community deserves the very best amenities. Her voice faltered as a distinct creaking sound emerged from the wooden structure. A few people in the crowd exchanged nervous glances. Walter stepped closer to the microphone, perhaps intending to reclaim control of the situation, but Cynthia waved him away and continued her speech. As I was saying, this bridge represents the forward thinking that makes Pinecrest Estates the premier community in this county. The creaking grew louder, more insistent. Now everyone could hear it, a protest from wood and metal under excessive strain. Small vibrations rippled through the railings. A champagne glass fell from someone's hand as the subtle movement threw them off balance. Walter's face had lost its triumphant expression, replaced by growing concern. He whispered something to Greg Thornton, who shook his head firmly and gestured for Cynthia to continue. They were committed to this performance of success, even as warning signs literally sounded beneath their feet. Before we cut the ribbon and officially open this beautiful addition to our community, Cynthia plowed ahead, her voice slightly higher than before, I want to recognize the entire HOA board who made this possible. Would all board members please join me at the center of the bridge? The remaining board members reluctantly made their way to the center, creating an even greater concentration of weight at the midpoint of the span. The creaking intensified, now accompanied by an ominous groaning from the support structures below. Through my camera, I could see that the eastern foundation was visibly shifting now, the soil beneath it compressing under the combined load of the structure and dozens of people. The slight tilt I had noticed weeks ago had become more pronounced. The decorative railings were no longer perfectly horizontal, but angled slightly downward toward the east bank. A few people at the edges of the crowd began discreetly stepping off the bridge, sensing that something was wrong. But the core group, the HOA board and their closest supporters, remained clustered at the center, determined to complete their ceremonial moment despite the increasingly obvious danger signals. And now, Walter reclaimed the microphone, his voice betraying only a slight tremor. It is my great honor to declare the Pinecrest Creek Bridge officially open for the enjoyment of all residents. He raised his champagne glass in a toast just as a sharp crack echoed from below, the sound of wood splintering under stress. For one frozen moment, everyone stood motionless, processing the implications of that sound. Then several things happened at once. The eastern support column, built on inadequate foundation and unstable soil, gave way completely, tearing free from its concrete base. Without this critical support, the entire bridge structure twisted violently, the wooden walkway buckling in the middle where the crowd was most concentrated. The decorative railings, designed for appearance rather than structural integrity, snapped like toothpicks under the lateral force. I continued recording as the bridge collapsed in what seemed like slow motion, though the entire catastrophic failure took less than 5 seconds. The once proud structure broke apart in sections, depositing screaming board members and residents into the shallow creek below. Walter Simmons, still clutching his champagne glass, disappeared beneath splintered wood and torn decorative elements. Cynthia's wide-brimmed hat floated away downstream, separated from its owner in the chaos. The collapse was not catastrophic enough to cause serious injuries. The creek was only about 3 feet deep at most points, with a soft, muddy bottom, but it was more than sufficient to create a scene of total humiliation for the HOA leadership. Immaculately dressed residents floundered in muddy water. Expensive clothing was ruined. Electronic devices were destroyed. And most significantly, The grand project that the HOA board had pushed through against all opposition and warnings had failed spectacularly in front of the entire community. I maintained my position, continuing to record as people struggled to shore, helping each other out of the wreckage. Some were crying. Others looked shell-shocked. A few were already shouting accusations at the board members who had assured them of the bridge's safety. My camera captured it all: the destruction, the chaos, the dawning realization among Ray. Silence that their leadership had failed them in a fundamental way. Within 20 minutes, emergency vehicles began arriving, an ambulance to check for injuries, sheriff's deputies to secure the scene, and remarkably, a county building inspector who had apparently been tipped off about potential issues with the structure. I noticed Roy Winters among the officials examining the collapsed bridge, shaking his head as he took photographs of the failed supports and inadequate connections. I approached one of the deputies, introduced myself as the property owner, and offered my continuous video recording of the entire event. He accepted it with interest, especially after I explained the background of the unauthorized construction and ignored safety warnings. "We will need a formal statement from you," he said. "This is not just a structural failure. There might be criminal negligence involved if they proceeded despite known safety issues." Over the following weeks, the consequences of that Sunday afternoon unfolded with satisfying thoroughness. The county launched a full investigation into the bridge collapse, uncovering the backdated permits, ignored warnings, and improper influence within the building department. The deputy director who had approved the dubious documents was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. The HOA board members faced personal liability suits from residents who had been on the bridge when it collapsed. Their homeowners' insurance declined coverage, citing deliberate disregard for safety warnings. Walter and Cynthia resigned from the board in disgrace when evidence emerged of their personal financial interests in the project. Most satisfying of all, the county prosecutor filed criminal charges against 3 board members for falsifying government documents, endangering public safety, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The investigation had revealed emails discussing how to circumvent proper procedures and ignore engineering requirements to reduce costs and accelerate completion. As for my property, a court order required the HOA to remove all debris from the collapsed bridge and restore the creek banks to their natural condition at the HOA's expense. My attorney filed a substantial civil suit for trespassing, property damage, and emotional distress, which the new HOA board quickly settled rather than risk further legal costs and negative publicity. 6 months after the collapse, little evidence remained of the ill-fated bridge. New vegetation had begun to reclaim the damaged areas along the creek banks. Wildlife had returned. The family of ducks rebuilt their nest in almost the same spot they had occupied before the construction. The water ran clear again, no longer clouded by construction runoff. I sat on my porch one evening, enjoying the sunset over my restored sanctuary. A movement at the property line caught my attention. A woman stood there, not one I recognized from the HOA confrontations. She waved tentatively, and I nodded acknowledgement. "I just wanted to apologize," she called. "I am part of the new HOA board. What happened here? It should never have happened. We found records showing they were planning to use access to your creek as a selling point for new properties. Some of them were developing nearby." "I know," I replied. "I figured that out too late to stop the bridge." She nodded. "The new board has adopted strict conflict of interest policies and transparency requirements, and we have formally abandoned any claim to access your property. It was never legal, and we know that now." After she left, I walked down to the creek bank where the bridge had stood. The only remaining evidence of the structure was a slightly darker patch of soil where one foundation had been removed. Nature was already erasing the last traces of human arrogance and entitlement. I had not asked for this fight. I had simply wanted to live peacefully on my own land, enjoying the natural beauty that had drawn me here. The Pinecrest HOA had chosen to ignore property rights, safety standards, and basic decency in pursuit of their goals. In the end, they had built their own downfall, as surely as they had built a bridge that could not stand. Some might call it karma, this perfect alignment of consequences. The HOA built their bridge on my land without permission, cutting corners and ignoring warnings. And in the end, they provided the perfect weight to test its inadequate design, their own bodies, their own pride, their own celebration of wrongdoing. I did not collapse their bridge. Physics did. I merely stood witness as natural laws delivered the justice that human laws had failed to provide. And in that moment of collapse, as the mighty fell into the mud of their own creation, a simple truth was revealed. No amount of money, influence, or arrogance can ultimately overcome reality. Some foundations simply cannot bear the weight placed upon them.